Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D RPG about a marine biologist that I'm building with the Godot engine. It's good to see y'all again. It's been about 2.5 months since I last posted on the channel, and I have to say it's been a nice break. When we last left off, I had just returned to work on Dauphin after wrapping up an app called Range, which was just a fun little productivity timer that I wanted to build in a few months, and it actually ended up being my first release on Steam. Made a big old devlog about that if you want to see how I built and released it, and of course you can go check it out on Steam if you're interested. In the weeks following that release, I was so excited to return to Dauphin that I jumped right back in and got to work on the next devlog. This was very intentional on my part. Despite the kind of anxiety and stress around releasing Range to Steam, releasing anything to Steam for the first time, I really wanted to build on that momentum and keep my foot on the gas and dive straight back into my passion project because I was so excited to get back to work on it. Despite my good intentions here, the problem was that I was just on the edge of burnout after hustling to get Range finished, especially given that it took like a month and a half longer than I expected. And in my attempt to power through that and get back to work on Dauphin, I ran straight into that wall. Knowing I needed a break, I took my foot way off the gas. I think I actually made a commendable effort to do something Dauphin related on many of these days, even if it was just brainstorming ideas for 5 minutes. But mostly, I gave myself the grace to just relax and do other things. I played through Oblivion Remastered, I played a ton of old school RuneScape, I read a couple books, including Tynan Sylvester's Designing Games, which was awesome, and I reckon I'll be mentioning quite a bit in future devlogs. And I kind of got back into running, which has been a great feeling. I didn't have much of a timeline set up for this break. I just kind of jumped in and figured I'd come back when I felt excited to dive back into this world that I've been building with Dauphin for like 5+ years at this point. And it is a really good feeling to be back. Of course, this makes me think of all the very fair questions I get in almost every devlog about when Dauphin is going to be complete. As you can tell, that's very tough for me to answer given the process that I follow here. But all I can really say is that for me, I feel like I have to prioritize this process. Game development is a hobby for me. It's something that I never want to dread or feel like is a chore or just feel like is getting totally stale in my life. So I have to give myself this kind of grace to come back excited like I am today to jump back into my projects. I will say it is incredibly important for me to bring Dauphin into the world. I really want to do this, and it's a big reason why I spent some time to work on Range so that I could actually get some experience releasing something. I don't want Dauphin to be something that I just make videos about forever and never release. The good news is, after reading this book that I mentioned before, I do have some ideas of, in the short term, how to work towards something that finally is becoming testable, that I can kind of get some feedback on and iterate upon, that'll really get us moving in the right direction towards getting hands on Dauphin for the first time. So we'll talk more about that, but I just want you to know it's important to me. With all that said, it's definitely time to finally jump back into the code, and we'll talk more as I do, but I want to start you out by showing you this visualization that I created called a dependency stack. And this is an idea that I borrowed from that Designing Games book. The thought here is that a dependency stack helps you visualize what is at the core of the experience that you're trying to design. With Dauphin, that's the idea of the player interacting with different environments and biomes, saving them from corruption and bringing them back to health. I've already made a bunch of progress with this system by kind of creating my islands that can support different types of organisms and my basic corruption system. Something I'm crucially missing as a part of this foundation is organisms' ability to interact with their environment. Meaning, as the player cleans up the environment, how do organisms react? This is totally foundational to what I ultimately want to deliver with Dauphin, so that's what we'll be thinking about this week. All right, I'm wrapping up this recording just after 5 p.m. here on Sunday evening. I'll look forward to seeing y'all first thing in the morning. Morning folks, happy Monday. I just wrapped up a productive development session this morning, and I want to give y'all a short update. I'll keep it quick since I'm still kind of getting back into the swing of things here. But long story short, an important way that I see environments changing in Dauphin is that the player will be collecting waste or litter from islands as they explore. This will do a few things for the player. It will increase their conservation skill, it will provide them with crafting materials, and most importantly, it will invite new or different organisms to come make their home on islands that become more clean and free of trash and waste as the player continues to explore. Now, quite a ways back, I had actually developed a few example scenes that represented different types of plastic, paper, and aluminum waste that the player could find on islands, but looking at that code this morning, I saw that it was in desperate need of a more modern refactor, so that was a great place for me to jump in to start my day. What I ended up creating was kind of a parent litter class, which has everything needed to represent a piece of waste that the player could find on an island. Of course, simple things like a collision shape and a sprite, but most importantly, an instance of my foraging node, which allows this to interact with the foraging system where the player can see some prompts to help them identify and collect things that they can pick up in the world. From this base class, I was able to create a few different kind of implementations of this litter, which we can see if I search for it here. So we now have aluminum, paper, and plastic litter that all inherit from this parent litter scene. And this will help me easily create new types of waste that I can put into the game later. The next step for me is going to be updating how I'm spawning this litter into the game world. I have this very nice entity spawner class that I wrote somewhat recently that allows me to spawn different items with different weights randomly into a fixed space in the world, which is exactly what I need here. But the problem is that I have to do this manually with a call to spawn items. What I'd love to do in the case of litter is perhaps spawn a few pieces into the world per each in-game day that passes, so kind of a realistic cadence at which you might expect new waste to appear into the world. Right now, I can do that on a fixed real-world time interval, but I don't have any way to do that in game time. Thankfully, I already have a time manager class. This lives as an autoload singleton and is responsible for helping me with my day-night cycle and my weather system. So what I really need to do here is build a custom timer node that works off of the time in my time manager instead of real time. So that's what I'll be working on next. Welcome back to Wednesday morning. It's just creeping up on 9 o'clock here, so I've got to keep this short since I need to log on to work, but I wanted to give you a quick update on how I'm spawning waste into the game as we talked about in the last update. First, I want to show you a change I made in my time manager class. Again, the idea behind this is that I want to be able to do things at certain in-game time intervals rather than real world time intervals. This class already tracked the in-game time, but what I've added here is 4 signals for dawn, noon, dusk, and midnight that I can hook into for certain systems where I actually care once we pass those breakpoints. So for example, if I want to always do something in-game at midnight, I can hook into this signal and I now have the ability to do that. You can see I'm doing just that here in my new litter spawner scene, which is an extension of the entity spawner that we previously looked at. Just a few very simple customizations here. You can see in my ready function, we're connecting to that midnight signal in the time manager. Once midnight passes, we are making the call to spawn litter, which calls this pre-existing spawn function an entity spawner. This is what we were calling manually before, but now this is going to be called at midnight. Apart from that, you can see that I'm keeping track of a max litter variable here as an export. The idea here is to make sure that a given island does not become super oversaturated with these litter objects. The way that I'm keeping track of that is just querying nodes in group in my tree. Now, all of my litter nodes are in the litter group, so this is easy to keep track of. And I just want to make sure that if we are at this maximum number, we don't spawn anymore. These updates have been pretty simple so far, but I think the next one is going to be a bit more tricky, and that will be updating my organism spawner class, which is responsible for creating all the organisms like the sand crabs that you see on my islands, and updating this to take into account that litter saturation value on the island itself, such that if we have a lower saturation of litter, we can choose to spawn more organisms. Off to work for now. We'll catch up soon. Well, hey folks, I'm joining you again on Friday afternoon after work here. I was hoping to get a lot more done before what's probably the last update of the devlog before the weekend here, but unfortunately, I'm just on the tail end of a 21-hour power outage that started yesterday after work. The good news is I did make some good progress before that storm rolled through yesterday, so let's take a look. Most of the changes I managed to make are within my organism spawner class that we looked at earlier, and some of these changes were quite small but quite impactful to the way that Dauphin works, as we'll look at here in a moment. The first of these changes that I want to look at is within my spawn organisms function. This is of course responsible for actually placing organisms into the game world. What I wanted to do here was achieve a lower number of spawning organisms if we had a higher saturation of pollution on the island, meaning those trash or litter items that exist on the island that we looked at before. There's certainly a number of ways I could have done this, but I chose to focus on one particular parameter for my poison disc sampling algorithm, which randomly chooses points on the island to place organisms. This particular parameter is what I call the spawn distance, and this is the ideal distance in between those individual points that this algorithm chooses. So with a greater distance, we have more distance in between the items that are spawned and therefore a lowered density of items that are spawned. So what I did here was choose to modify that density essentially based on the pollution saturation by writing this little helper function. All the magic is happening on line 138 here. We have our default distance that is provided, I think, through an export variable up at the top of this file. And then we take our pollution saturation. If this is 100% pollution saturation, this will be a value of 1. So this will effectively stay the same. If, however, the players collected a lot of trash or litter from the islands, this value could be as low as 0.1 or perhaps even lower. That will decrease the minimum distance between spawned items and effectively increase the density of organisms that appear. As a quick demo, we can take a look at what happens when that pollution saturation of this island changes. Now, we can't really see much of what's happening here. You'll have to take my word for it that we have about 75 pieces of litter spawned throughout this island. If I zoom really far out, I know this doesn't look great, we can see that, yeah, there's a handful of these crabs walking around, but this is not a particularly densely populated island in terms of life forms for the player to go interact with. If we look down at the debug console here for that scene that was just running, you can see some helpers that I've been printing out here. The pollution saturation for that island was 0.73. The reason for that is because, as I mentioned, we have about 75 pieces of litter spawned with a maximum threshold of 100 for this island, so this kind of checks out. And our organism spawner decided that 18 organisms were appropriate here. If I now go into the scene tree for my Coral Island scene here and just scroll very far down in my entity's parent until we start to find litter objects, I'm just going to try to find where these start and delete almost all of them such that we have almost no litter in the scene here. Back on the island here, we can zoom out again and see that we have a much higher concentration of these crabs that have spawned all over the island because we now have less pollution. We can double check that back in the console here where we can see that I did manage to successfully delete every litter item from the scene there, and as a result we jumped up from 18 to 63 organisms. The last simple but important change I had to make to support this system was modifying when my organisms are actually spawned into the world. If you look back at a previous devlog where we overhauled the flora and fauna spawners on my island, you may remember that I do that manually by clicking the spawn button here because these are tool scripts. That, unfortunately, is pretty static. It means that I'm adding all these organisms into the world at development time here instead of at runtime. Because the player is interacting with the world at runtime, I want to also modify the way that organisms spawn at runtime. To do that, I added a simple enumeration to my organism spawner class called spawn mode, and I can choose manual if I want to manually spawn in organisms like for my flora, or automatic if I want to do this at runtime, like with my fauna or my sand crabs and jellyfish and sandpipers, as you can see over here. The way that this manifests in the code is super simple. It's just in my ready function for the organism spawner. If we have our spawn mode set to automatic, we want to spawn on ready every time this scene is loaded up into the tree. Like I said, it's a pretty small change here, but the result is a world that all of a sudden is responding to the player's actions. As the player goes and cleans up litter from these islands, more organisms will start to spawn in. And this is really only the beginning as I see it. Right now we just have a greater quantity of organisms spawning, but I'd love to see a greater variety of organisms come in as well. Those organisms will present their own combat challenges when they're corrupted. They'll drop different crafting materials, and hopefully you can see kind of where my head's going with the gameplay loop here. This was a really enjoyable and pretty chill week getting back into the groove of filming and development here, and I really hope you guys enjoyed the devlog. As always, I really want to thank the folks who support this channel and Dauphin's development on Patreon. My beta supporter this month is Mike Conway, and my Grommy supporters are Ben Van Dyken, David L., Kyle Van Riper, and Deluse. I will endeavor to keep making these shorter, kind of simpler devlogs that don't necessarily focus on huge features. I think they're just much easier for me to make, and it's also fun to show y'all really everything that happens with the development of Dauphin, not just the fun, flashy stuff. But anyway, with all that said, I hope y'all enjoyed. Thanks for joining me for this one. I'll see you in the next one.